What if the most hated man in the history of Christianity was not a traitor at all? What if Judas Iscariot, the disciple who supposedly betrayed Jesus Christ for 30 pieces of silver, was actually the only one among the 12 who truly understood what Jesus was and what he came to do? For almost 2,000 years, the name Judas has been synonymous with betrayal, treachery, and damnation. He is the villain of the greatest story ever told, the man whose kiss sealed the fate of the Son of God. But in 1978, buried in the sands of the Egyptian desert, a codex was discovered that would challenge everything we thought we knew about Judas, about Jesus, and about the very nature of salvation itself. It is called the Gospel of Judas, and the early church considered it so dangerous that they tried to destroy every copy in existence. Welcome to Eternal Enigma, and today we are going to open this forbidden text and explore the shocking revelations hidden within its pages. What you are about to hear is drawn from ancient manuscripts, Gnostic theology, and early church history. This is not about attacking any faith or promoting heresy. It is about understanding a perspective that was deliberately silenced and asking why the early church was so terrified of what Judas had to say. Because the Gospel of Judas does not just tell a different version of the betrayal. It tells a completely different story about who Jesus was, what he taught in secret, and why he needed Judas to do the one thing that no other disciple had the courage to do. So prepare yourself, because once you hear this story, the version you grew up with will never sound quite the same again. The story of how the Gospel of Judas survived is almost as extraordinary as its contents. In 1978, a group of Egyptian farmers stumbled upon a limestone cave near the town of El Minya in Middle Egypt. Inside, they found a codex, a bound collection of papyrus pages, wrapped in leather and preserved by the dry desert climate for nearly 1,700 years. The farmers had no idea what they had found. They sold the codex to an antiquities dealer, and for the next several decades, the manuscript passed through the hands of multiple dealers, collectors, and middlemen, each one more interested in profit than preservation. During these years, the codex was stored in terrible conditions. At one point, it was placed in a safety deposit box on Long Island, New York, where it sat for 16 years in humid conditions that caused significant deterioration. Pages crumbled, ink faded, and portions of the text were lost forever. It was not until 2001 that the National Geographic Society finally acquired the codex and began the painstaking work of restoration and translation. In 2006, nearly 30 years after its discovery, the Gospel of Judas was finally published and made available to the world. The text itself is written in Coptic, the language of early Egyptian Christians, and carbon dating places the manuscript to around the 3rd or 4th century. However, scholars believe the original Greek version was composed much earlier, likely in the 2nd century, placing it within the same era as many other early Christian texts that were eventually excluded from the Bible. But here is what makes the discovery truly remarkable. The early church father Aeneas, writing around 180, specifically mentioned and condemned the Gospel of Judas in his work against heresies. This means the text was already circulating among early Christians and was considered threatening enough that church authorities felt the need to publicly denounce it. For over 18 centuries, scholars assumed the Gospel of Judas was lost forever. Its discovery in the Egyptian desert proved that despite the best efforts of the Orthodox Church, some forbidden texts refused to stay buried. To understand the Gospel of Judas, you first need to understand the worldview that produced it, because this text does not come from mainstream Christianity. It comes from a tradition known as Gnosticism, and the Gnostic understanding of reality is radically different from anything taught in churches today. The Gnostics believe that the material world, everything you can see and touch, is not the creation of the true God. Instead, it is the flawed and often malicious creation of a lesser deity they called the demiurge. In many Gnostic systems, this demiurge is identified with the God of the Old Testament, the deity who created Adam and Eve, who flooded the earth, who demanded animal sacrifices and obedience. For the Gnostics, this was not the supreme divine being, but an ignorant and sometimes cruel entity who trapped divine sparks of light inside physical bodies, imprisoning spiritual beings in a world of matter, suffering, and death. Above the demiurge exists the true God, an infinite and unknowable source of pure light and spirit that the Gnostics sometimes called the monad, or the invisible spirit. This true God did not create the physical world and has no interest in material things. The goal of human existence, according to the Gnostics, is not to obey the demiurge or worship within his creation, but to awaken to the divine spark within yourself, to to remember your true spiritual origin and to escape the prison of the material world entirely. This is gnosis, the sacred knowledge that sets the soul free. Now here is why this matters for the Gospel of Judas. In this framework, Jesus did not come to earth to die for sins as Orthodox Christianity teaches. He came as a messenger from the true God, sent to awaken humanity to the truth about their spiritual imprisonment and to teach the secret knowledge necessary for liberation. And according to the Gospel of Judas, there was only one disciple who truly understood this mission. The Gospel of Judas opens with a statement that immediately sets it apart from the canonical Gospels. It describes itself as the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot. Not a public sermon, not a parable told to crowds, a private revelation given exclusively to Judas because he alone was capable of receiving it. In the text, Jesus frequently laughs at the other disciples. This is one of the most striking and disturbing elements of the Gospel. When the 12 gather to pray and give thanks over bread, Jesus laughs at them. When they ask why he is laughing, he tells them that they are not doing this because they want to, but because through their actions their God, meaning the demiurge, will be praised. The disciples become angry and confused. They believe they are worshiping the true God, but Jesus tells them that none of them truly know him. He challenges them to stand before him and demonstrate their understanding, and not a single one can do it except Judas. Judas steps forward and says to Jesus, "I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbello, and I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you." Barbello in Gnostic theology is one of the first emanations of the true God, a divine figure associated with forethought and the highest spiritual realms. By recognizing that Jesus comes from Barbello and not from the God of this world, Judas demonstrates that he alone possesses genuine gnosis. He understands what the other disciples cannot grasp, that Jesus is not a Messiah sent by the Old Testament God, but an emissary from a realm far beyond this flawed creation. Jesus responds to Judas by separating him from the others and promising to teach him the mysteries of the kingdom. He tells Judas that he will grieve greatly because someone else will replace him among the 12, so that the 12 may again come to completion with their God. This is a reference to the later selection of Matthias to replace Judas, and the phrase "their God" makes it clear that Jesus views the other disciples as followers of the demiurge, not of the true divine source. One of the most dramatic passages in the Gospel of Judas involves a vision that the disciples share and bring to Jesus for interpretation. The 12 describe seeing a great house with a large altar surrounded by a crowd of people. They see 12 men whom they identify as priests, performing sacrifices at the altar. Some are sacrificing their own children, others their wives. Some are sleeping with other men. Some are involved in a multitude of sins and lawless deeds. And the 12 men standing before the altar invoke the name of Jesus over all these acts. The disciples are disturbed by this vision and ask Jesus what it means. His answer is devastating. He tells them that the 12 priests they saw at the altar are themselves. They are the 12 disciples. The crowd being led astray represents the people who follow their teaching. The sacrifices represent the suffering and harm that will be done in the name of the religion they will establish. In other words, Jesus is telling his own disciples that the church they will build after his death will become a corrupt institution, one that will commit atrocities in his name while believing it serves God. This passage is extraordinary because it can be read as a direct critique of organized Christianity, written by a community of Gnostic believers who saw the Orthodox Church as a betrayal of Jesus' actual teachings. The animal sacrifices, the violence, the sins committed at the altar, all of these could be interpreted as references to the persecutions, crusades, and institutional corruption that would indeed characterize much of Christian history. Whether or not one accepts this interpretation, the power of the passage is undeniable. It presents Jesus himself as predicting and condemning the future church, a perspective that the Orthodox authorities would have found not just heretical, but existentially threatening. After separating Judas from the others, Jesus reveals to him a complex cosmological vision that forms the theological heart of the gospel. This cosmology is deeply Gnostic and radically different from anything found in the canonical Bible. Jesus describes a vast spiritual universe populated by aeons, divine emanations that exist in luminous clouds far beyond the material world. At the highest level exists the great invisible spirit, the true God who is beyond all description and comprehension. From this spirit emerged successive emanations, including the divine realm of Barbello, the figure Judas had correctly identified as the source of Jesus. Below these highest realms, lesser spiritual beings emerge, and it is here that things go wrong. Jesus describes how a being called Nebro, whose name means rebel, and another called Socklus, whose name means fool, come into existence. These are not benevolent creators. Nebro is described as defiled and having a face flashing with fire, while Socklus is the one who actually creates humanity. If these names sound familiar, they should. Socklus is one of the Gnostic names for the demiurge, the ignorant god who creates the material world as a prison for divine sparks. In many Gnostic systems, Socklus is identified directly with the God of the Old Testament. The implications are staggering. According to this cosmology, humanity was created not by the supreme God, but by a foolish rebel spirit. The physical world is not a divine gift, but a cage, and the God worshipped in the temples and churches of mainstream religion is not the true God at all, but a lesser, ignorant entity who mistakenly believes himself to be the creator of everything. This is the knowledge that Jesus shares only with Judas. The other 11 disciples are left in their ignorance, worshipping Socklus, while believing they worship the highest God. Only Judas is entrusted with the full truth about the nature of reality, and this knowledge is what prepares him for the role he must play. And now we arrive at the moment that defines this entire gospel, the act that has made Judas the most despised figure in Western civilization. In the canonical Gospels, Judas betrays Jesus out of greed, or demonic possession, or simple treachery. He goes to the chief priests, accepts 30 pieces of silver, and identifies Jesus with a kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is a villain, a cautionary tale about the dangers of avarice and spiritual weakness. But the Gospel of Judas tells a completely different story. In this text, Jesus turns to Judas and says something that changes everything. He says, "You will exceed all of them," meaning all the other disciples, "for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Read that again carefully. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me. In Gnostic theology, the physical body is merely a garment, a temporary shell that imprisons the divine spirit within. Jesus is not asking Judas to kill him. He is asking Judas to help him escape. By handing Jesus over to the authorities, Judas is not betraying his master. He is performing the ultimate act of service, liberating the divine spirit of Jesus from its physical prison so that it can return to the realm of the true God. This is not a betrayal. It is a sacrifice, and it is a sacrifice that only Judas can perform because only Judas understands the true nature of what Jesus is. The other disciples would never agree to this because they do not possess the gnosis to understand why it is necessary. They see the physical body as sacred. They see death as a tragedy. Only Judas sees the body for what it really is, a cage, and understands that destroying it is an act of liberation, not murder. This reframing is perhaps the most revolutionary idea in all of early Christian literature. It transforms Judas from the greatest villain in history into the greatest hero, the one disciple who loved Jesus enough to bear the hatred of the entire world in order to fulfill his master's most sacred wish. If you understand how radically the Gospel of Judas challenges Orthodox Christianity, then you understand why the early church responded to it with such ferocity. The church father Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, writing around 180 in his massive work against heresies, specifically denounces the Gospel of Judas and the community that produced it. He calls them the Cainites, a Gnostic sect that he claims deliberately reversed the moral values of the Bible, venerating figures like Cain, Esau, and the people of Sodom precisely because Orthodox Christianity condemned them. Whether the Cainites actually existed as Irenaeus described them or whether he was exaggerating for polemical purposes remains debated among scholars. But his reaction reveals just how dangerous the church considered this text. The Gospel of Judas threatens Orthodox Christianity on multiple levels. First, it undermines the authority of the 12 apostles, the very foundation upon which the church claimed its legitimacy. If Jesus himself considered 11 of the 12 to be ignorant followers of a false god, then the entire apostolic succession, the chain of authority from the apostles to the bishops to the pope, collapses. Second, it presents an alternative understanding of salvation that eliminates the need for the institutional church entirely. If salvation comes through gnosis, through personal spiritual knowledge, then you do not need priests, sacraments, rituals, or a hierarchical religious organization. You need only the spark of divine knowledge within yourself. Third, and perhaps most devastatingly, it suggests that the God worshipped by mainstream Christianity is not the true God. If the Orthodox Church is built upon worship of the demiurge, a foolish and ignorant creator who imprisoned divine spirits in matter, then the entire structure of Christian worship is not just wrong but actively harmful, binding people more tightly to the very prison from which Jesus came to liberate them. Faced with these implications, the Church did what it always did with texts it considered dangerous. It declared them heretical, ordered their destruction, and persecuted the communities that preserved them. The Gospel of Judas was meant to disappear forever. That it survived at all is something of a miracle, or perhaps, depending on your perspective, something more than a miracle. There is one passage in the Gospel of Judas that has generated enormous debate among scholars and deserves special attention. Jesus says to Judas, "Lift up your eyes and look at the cloud and the light within it and the stars surrounding it. The star that leads the way is your star." This is an extraordinary statement. In Gnostic theology, each person possesses a star that represents their true spiritual self, their divine origin beyond the material world. By telling Judas that his star leads the way, Jesus is confirming that Judas has a unique spiritual destiny, one that surpasses all the other disciples. Some scholars have interpreted this as Jesus telling Judas that he will ascend to the highest spiritual realms after completing his mission. Others see it as a more ambiguous statement, suggesting that Judas will undergo tremendous suffering, but that his suffering has cosmic meaning and purpose. The image of the star is powerful because it connects the Gospel of Judas to broader astronomical and astrological traditions in the ancient world. In many ancient cultures, stars were not just physical objects, but spiritual entities, the visible manifestations of divine beings. The idea that each person has a guiding star connects to concepts found in Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and even certain strands of Jewish mysticism. But the passage also carries a darker undertone. In the Gnostic worldview, the stars and planets are often associated with the archons, the cosmic rulers who serve the demiurge and help maintain the prison of the material world. The fact that Judas has a star could mean he transcends the archons, or it could mean he is entangled with them in ways that even gnosis cannot fully resolve. This ambiguity is part of what makes the Gospel of Judas such a rich and challenging text. It does not offer simple answers. It offers layers of meaning that continue to reward careful study and contemplation. Since its publication in 2006, the Gospel of Judas has been the subject of intense academic debate. Scholars remain divided on several key questions, and these disagreements reveal just how complex and layered this text truly is. The initial translation and interpretation, led by the National Geographic team, presented the Gospel as a largely positive portrayal of Judas, casting him as the hero of the story and the most enlightened disciple. This reading generated enormous public interest and made international headlines. However, in the years that followed, several prominent scholars challenged this interpretation. April DeConnick, a professor of biblical studies, published a detailed retranslation arguing that certain key passages had been misread. She contended that far from being elevated, Judas is actually identified in the text as a demon, specifically the 13th demon, a figure associated with the rulers of the material world rather than the spiritual realm. Under her reading, the Gospel of Judas is not a rehabilitation of Judas, but an even darker condemnation, presenting him as a cosmic puppet manipulated by forces beyond his understanding. Other scholars have proposed middle ground interpretations. Some argue that the Gospel presents Judas as a tragic figure, someone who possesses genuine knowledge but whose role in the cosmic drama is nevertheless one of suffering and sacrifice. In this reading, Judas is neither simply a hero nor a villain, but a complex figure trapped between worlds, possessing enough gnosis to understand what is happening, but not enough power to escape his fate. What all scholars agree on is that the Gospel of Judas is a genuine ancient text that represents an authentic strand of early Christian thought. It is not a forgery, a hoax, or a modern creation. It is the voice of a community of believers who saw Jesus, Judas, and the nature of salvation in a fundamentally different way from the tradition that eventually became mainstream Christianity. And the very existence of this text forces us to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. The Christianity that survived and became dominant was not the only Christianity that existed. There were other voices, other gospels, other understandings of who Jesus was and what he taught. Most of those voices were silenced. The Gospel of Judas is one of the few that refused to be. The Gospel of Judas raises questions that go far beyond academic theology, questions that strike at the heart of how we understand history, authority, and truth itself. If the early church actively suppressed texts that offered alternative perspectives on Jesus and his teachings, what else was lost? The Gospel of Judas survived by accident, buried in a cave and forgotten for 17 centuries. How many other texts were successfully destroyed? How many other perspectives on early Christianity were permanently erased? These are not trivial questions. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, revealed dozens of Gnostic texts that had been unknown for centuries, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the apocrypha of John. Each of these texts presents a version of Christianity that is dramatically different from the Orthodox tradition. Together with the Gospel of Judas, they paint a picture of early Christianity as a diverse and often contradictory movement, one in which multiple groups claimed to possess the true teachings of Jesus and bitterly contested each other's authority. The version that won was not necessarily the most authentic or the closest to what Jesus actually taught. It was the version that had the most political power, the most institutional support, and the most willingness to use force against its rivals. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The Council of Nicaea in 325, the edicts of Emperor Theodosius in 380, the systematic destruction of non-canonical texts, and the persecution of heretical communities. These are historical facts that shape the Christianity we know today. The Gospel of Judas is a window into a road not taken, a version of Christianity in which salvation was personal rather than institutional, in which knowledge was valued above obedience, and in which the most despised figure in the story was actually the one who understood it best. So what do we make of the Gospel of Judas? Was Judas truly a secret agent of Christ, the only disciple brave enough to perform the one act that would liberate his master from the prison of the flesh? Or was he, as the Orthodox tradition insists, simply a greedy traitor who sold out the Son of God for 30 pieces of silver? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the complexity between these extremes. What the Gospel of Judas shows us, regardless of whether we accept its theology, is that the story of Jesus was never as simple as we were taught. There were always other voices, other perspectives, other gospels that told the story differently. The fact that one tradition won and silenced the others does not mean it held a monopoly on truth. It means it held a monopoly on power. The Gospel of Judas survived against all odds. It was buried, forgotten, damaged, nearly destroyed by neglect and greed. And yet here it is, still speaking after nearly 2,000 years, still asking the questions that the early church tried to silence forever. Perhaps the most powerful lesson of this text is not about Judas at all. It is about the nature of truth itself. Truth does not die because someone declares it heretical. Truth does not disappear because powerful institutions try to bury it. Sometimes truth waits patiently in the darkness, hidden in a cave in the Egyptian desert, until the world is finally ready to hear what it has to say. If this video challenged the way you think about history, religion, and the stories we have been told, then subscribe to Eternal Enigma and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden texts, the forbidden knowledge, and the buried truths that someone somewhere decided you were never supposed to know. Because the deeper we dig, the more we realize that the most dangerous thing in the world is not heresy. It is the fear of asking questions.